Hi, this is Sean Paul Murphy. Earlier, I promised I would read a chapter of one of my books every week while we were still on coronavirus lockdown. In addition to my two books, Chapel Street and The Promise, I said I would read a chapter here and there of some of my works in progress. This week, I'm going to go with a book called Unconditional. Unconditional is the sequel to my memoir, The Promise, or The Pros and Cons of Talking with God. This book, like the original, is about my relationship with God and how that relationship plays out in a relationship I had with a woman. When this relationship began in the early 1990s, I prayed to God about this woman, Andrea. God told me to show her his love, but I chose to show her my love instead. Needless to say, disaster ensued. I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 1. A photograph. I'm looking at a picture of Andrea Barnes. At least that's the name she wore when we first met. She was adopted. Her birth name was Kilby. That name was alien to her for the first 30 years of her life. She was raised as Andrea Canode. Barnes was the name of her first husband and the father of her two sons. Later she would become Andrea Cummings. Later she would become Andrea Pina. Never would she be Andrea Murphy, as much as I tried. And I did. This is the last photograph I took of her. Considering the years we spent together, on and off, I have surprisingly few photographs of her. If I had realized during our happiest moment that our time together would be so limited, I would have snapped more photos as keepsakes. But I didn't. It has always been my nature to accept my current emotional status as permanent. When I am happy, I find myself unwilling to gaze down the tracks to the missing bridge up ahead that inevitably spells disaster. Andrea provided exactly that kind of distraction. When she sought to do so, Andrea could make a man feel like he was the center of the universe. I am not alone in believing that. The picture was taken in my small two-bedroom brick home in the leafy Hamilton neighborhood of northeast Baltimore City. It was a weekday afternoon, summer, around 1 o'clock. I was home writing, which at the time served more as an avocation than vocation, when I heard a knock at the door. I was equally delighted and surprised to see her when I opened the front door. She looked terrific, as always. Andy possessed the trim, tan, outdoorsy body of a natural-born farm girl. Her legs were firm and shapely, sculpted by life itself rather than the gym. Pleasingly buxom, she was also crowned by a mane of shoulder-length blonde hair. She wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt. I had recently heard a fashion maven proclaim that men find women sexiest in faded jeans and a t-shirt. I must admit it certainly worked for me. Mostly, however, it was her smile that delighted me. She was wearing her happy smile. More often than not, a noticeable tinge of cynicism lurked just around the corners of her smiles, as if she inherently knew whatever joy she felt at the moment would be short-lived at best. Many times, too many to recall, she would quietly ask me if she looked happy. At first I took the question for a complaint, as if she were not so subtly indicating that I wasn't performing the task at hand adequately to please her. Later I realized she just generally wanted to know if she looked happy. Andrea always wanted to look happy, even if the turmoil and traumas of her life made the actuality of happiness itself difficult to achieve over the long run. I, however, was genuinely happy to find that Andrea, the happy Andrea, standing at my door, but her presence did indeed surprise me. We had undergone one of our many breakups about 6 weeks earlier. Who broke up with whom? It didn't matter. Each of us broke up with the other. The first couple of times, regardless of whose decision it was, I underwent all of the expected emotional distress. By now I accepted our separations as part of the dance. Sometimes she led, sometimes I led. Somehow we always ended up back together for one more round. That's the way it looked now. Andy was unusually coy and playful. She always called first before she made a visit. This time she didn't. She just said she happened to be in the neighborhood. That was unlikely. Andrea lived on a peaceful farm far outside of my noisy city. There was nothing she needed in my neighborhood, except possibly me. And it looked like she needed me. or at least wanted me. Without any outward invitations being offered or sought, our feet slowly migrated on their own volition to the stairs heading to the bedroom while we chatted flirtatiously. This was a rather surprising development. Usually, after a breakup, our relationship would undergo a period of rebuilding before sexual intimacy became a possibility. Despite my genuine and sincere Christian faith, and in spite of our decidedly unmarried state, I was delighted by the prospect that lay before me. Delighted? I was practically panting for her. Long before Andrea entered my life, I loved a girl very deeply, but also very innocently. We dated passionately for years without ever crossing the boundary we felt the Lord had placed before us. We were waiting for marriage, but when marriage didn't materialize, I must admit I felt cheated. Where's my reward for my abstinence? I had sacrificed and seemingly got nothing in return. I often wondered if I knew how our relationship would end, would I have taken advantage of the temptation we both eagerly felt and made love? I have to admit I probably would have. After the collapse of that relationship, I kept away from the world of dating for nearly a decade. When I threw my hat back in the ring, sexual temptation seemed as omnipresent as the Lord himself. I was older now. So were the women I dated. Most of them had already been married. They were accustomed to being in sexual relationships. They enjoyed sex. The idea of waiting for marriage usually seemed sweet to them at first, but invariably it became an annoyance, even to women who claimed to be Christians. In our modern adult world, chastity seemed like an arbitrary, artificial barrier. Still, despite some very close calls, I managed to maintain my virginity out of an increasingly grudging obedience to God, until I met Andrea. What was it about Andrea that had so inflamed my desire? Why did my long-held values collapse so completely in her presence? Was it her beauty, or her sweet yet seductive laugh, or her personality, or her obvious yearning for completeness? Or was it all about my needs? Was I simply tired of waiting? Did I really love her? I swore to myself that I had the purest of intentions, but desire can blind even the wisest eyes. All I knew was that I had to have her. I would endure any indignity and break any vow to have her, or so I thought. One thing was certain. I wanted her that day. The famine was over. I could feel her flesh against mine one more time. Perhaps fearing, as I always did, that this could be our last time, I told her I wanted to take a picture of her. I went over to the coffee table and grabbed my camera. While I sat down on the stairs, Andrea crouched down with her elbow on her knee and her chin cupped in her hand. Her smile perfectly captured the playful seductiveness of the moment. It remains my best photograph of her, but there was something odd about it. Right before I pulled my eye away from the viewfinder, I noticed something on her left hand, a big diamond ring. It couldn't be what I thought it was. Lowering the camera, I asked, "What's that ring?" The playfulness left her voice.
I'm engaged.
Engaged? I couldn't believe it. We had broken up less than 2 months ago. I couldn't find the words to speak.
I don't want to marry him,
She said, pleading.
but I don't know what to do. He's already gone to the courthouse and gotten us a marriage license.
Was that all it took? Andrea and I were engaged very briefly earlier in the year before our relationship fell apart for the umpteenth time. Would we be enjoying marital bliss now if I had simply rushed out and procured a marriage license? Would that have made her feel obligated? I didn't know what to say. The smile that had so captivated me when she first arrived was gone. Her eyes were now filled with sadness. If she truly loved her fiancé, she wouldn't be here with me now, but I knew she would marry him. I could see it. This man, whose existence was completely unknown to me until that moment, would enjoy the reward I would have abased myself in any way to achieve. She was pleading with me with her eyes not to hate her. I believe she came offering herself to me that afternoon as an apology. I'm sure she would have told me about her fiancé later, as she got dressed, after one final sweet interlude of freedom and forgetfulness. She knew the news would hurt me, but she knew I wouldn't judge her. I never did. I couldn't. She shared too many tales of abuse and heartache with me over the years. In her heart, she was still a precious little girl who had lost her innocence too soon and too violently. I couldn't burden her with my judgment, nor could I make love to her that afternoon. It was strange. My desire for her was strong enough for me to break my vows to my God, but not strong enough for me to violate Andrea's vows to her would-be husband. Was I freaking crazy? That's what I wonder whenever I look at that picture. That one image captured everything I desired about Andrea and everything that pushed me away. When I look into those eyes, I do not see her weakness. I see my own. I failed her. I hope you enjoyed that chapter of Unconditional. The best way to encourage me to finish the book would be to buy 15,000 copies of my first memoir, The Promise or the Pros and Cons of Talking with God. Until then, feel free to check out my blog, SeanPaulMurphyville.blogspot.com, for all things Sean Paul Murphy. Till then, see you later.